Hello everyone, before we begin tonight's haunting tale, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a moment of the fear. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time the unknown feels closest to you. Now, settle in, dim the lights, and let the whispers of the unknown guide you through the eerie corridors of our story. Ready to face the darkness? The town of Ridgefield was known for its quaint charm, cobblestone streets, and an air of old-world sophistication. Nestled in the heart of this picturesque locale stood the Crescent Hotel, a towering structure that seemed to bridge the gap between the past and present. Its stately facade, with intricate stonework and grand, arched windows, whispered stories of its former life as a military hospital. Though the hotel had undergone a luxurious transformation, the shadow of its history lingered, casting an invisible pall over its halls. From the moment guests arrived, they were struck by the building's duality. A welcoming lobby adorned with crystal chandeliers and marble floors juxtaposed against the creaks and groans of a structure that had seen over a century of life. The staff spoke warmly of the hotel's amenities, its rooftop bar with sweeping views of the town, its gourmet restaurant serving locally sourced delicacies, but avoided mentioning the one thing everyone inevitably asked about: the fourth floor. The fourth floor of the Crescent Hotel was an enigma, sealed off behind a heavy oak door marked with a brass "Do Not Enter" plaque. Management claimed it was under perpetual renovation, but locals knew better. Stories of muffled cries, flickering lights, and inexplicable cold drafts had circulated for years. Whispered tales painted the floor as a hotspot of paranormal activity, a place where the veil between the living and the dead had worn thin. Megan Carter first heard about the hotel in an online forum dedicated to urban legends and haunted locales. As a history major with a penchant for uncovering forgotten narratives, she was immediately intrigued. The Crescent's past as a makeshift military hospital during wartime offered fertile ground for her curiosity. It wasn't just the architecture or the luxury that drew her in, it was the questions no one seemed willing to answer. Why had the fourth floor been sealed off? What had happened during those desperate days when soldiers were brought in from the front lines, their fates hanging by a thread? Megan's research unearthed a litany of tragedies tied to the hospital. It had been established during a conflict that ravaged the region, its halls repurposed from a grand hotel to a trauma center overnight. The fourth floor, in particular, had been designated as a quarantine zone for soldiers infected with a mysterious illness. Medical records were sparse, but the few that remained hinted at desperate measures, experimental treatments, untested drugs, and a growing body count. By the time the hospital closed its doors, the fourth floor had gained a reputation as a place of despair and death. Despite its grim history, the Crescent Hotel had managed to reinvent itself as a beacon of luxury. The owners spared no expense in its renovation, preserving the building's historic charm while adding modern comforts. Yet, no amount of marble or mahogany could erase the stories. Locals whispered of ghostly apparitions, shadowy figures glimpsed in windows, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing the fourth floor, footsteps that stopped abruptly, as if realizing they were being overheard. For Megan, the decision to visit the Crescent was an easy one. Her best friend, Ryan Alvarez, was eager to join her, hoping to spin the experience into a gripping feature for the university newspaper. Emily Harper, a psychology student with a knack for sensing vibes, was more hesitant but couldn't resist Megan's enthusiasm. Rounding out the group was Jack Nolan, whose fascination with ghost hunting gadgets provided a practical edge to their plans. Armed with EMF detectors, thermal cameras, and an unshakable sense of adventure, the quartet set their sights on uncovering the truth. The group arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, the town streets bathed in golden sunlight. The Crescent Hotel loomed before them, its grandeur both inviting and imposing. As they stepped into the lobby, they were greeted by the cheerful concierge, who handed them their keys and recited the hotel's amenities with practiced ease. Megan listened politely, her eyes drifting toward the staircase at the far end of the room. It spiraled upward, its polished banister gleaming, but her gaze stopped at the third floor. Beyond that, the staircase disappeared behind the infamous oak door. "It's just a door," Megan murmured to herself, though the weight in her chest suggested otherwise. The others, noticing her distraction, exchanged knowing glances. The fourth floor was why they were here, and no amount of luxury or hospitality would keep them from uncovering its secrets. That evening, as the group settled into their adjoining rooms, the mood shifted. The hotel was eerily quiet, its long corridors bathed in dim, golden light. The wallpaper, a pattern of delicate vines and flowers, seemed to ripple slightly, as if caught in a non-existent breeze. Ryan joked about the hotel's attempts to set the mood, but even he couldn't ignore the faint creaks and groans that echoed through the walls. As night fell, the sense of unease grew. Emily sat by the window, staring out at the town below. "It feels heavy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like the air is pressing down on me." "It's just the history," Megan replied, though she felt it too. The hotel's past seemed to seep into every corner, an invisible weight that refused to be ignored. Jack, ever the skeptic, fiddled with his EMF detector, muttering about electromagnetic interference. But when the device began to beep softly, even he couldn't dismiss the possibility that something was amiss. By the time they turned in for the night, the group had agreed on a plan. Tomorrow, they would explore the hotel, starting with its public spaces and working their way toward the 4th floor. Megan had already secured an interview with one of the longtime staff members, a housekeeper who had worked at the Crescent for decades. If anyone knew the truth about the 4th floor, it was her. As Megan lay in bed, staring at the ornate ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel was watching her. Every creak, every distant sound seemed deliberate, as if the building itself were alive. She thought of the stories she had read, the accounts of guests who had heard whispers in the night, seen shadows flit across their walls. It was easy to dismiss such tales in the light of day, but in the darkness of her room, they felt all too real. And then, just as sleep began to claim her, she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps above her, pacing back and forth. Megan froze, her breath catching in her throat. The 4th floor was supposed to be empty, sealed off. Yet the footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, and Megan's heart raced as she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with possibilities. "It's just the building," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But deep down, she knew better. The 4th floor wasn't just a legend. It was real, and it was waiting. Beneath the polished elegance of the Crescent Hotel lay a history that few dared to speak of. Originally built in the late 19th century as a grand luxury resort, the building had been commandeered during wartime to serve as a makeshift military hospital. Its transformation was as abrupt as it was jarring, with opulent dining rooms turned into triage centers and lavish suites converted into cramped recovery wards. It was a place where the lines between healing and despair blurred, where the gilded facade masked an undercurrent of suffering. The 4th floor bore the heaviest burden of this transition. Designated as a quarantine zone, it housed soldiers stricken with a mysterious illness that swept through the ranks during the height of the conflict. The records referred to it simply as the fever, a virulent condition that defied the primitive medical knowledge of the time. Symptoms included high fevers, uncontrollable tremors, and eventually, severe delirium. Those who were sent to the 4th floor rarely came back down. Local historians pieced together fragments of the hospital's dark history from scattered records and oral accounts. While official documents from that era were often sanitized to protect the hospital's reputation, personal diaries and letters told a grimmer story. Nurses wrote of sleepless nights haunted by the cries of the afflicted, of shadowy figures glimpsed at the end of long corridors, and of a growing unease that seemed to pervade the entire 4th floor. One particularly chilling entry described how the doors to the quarantine rooms would sometimes open and close on their own, as if the spirits of the dead were still wandering the halls. After the war ended, the hospital was abandoned, its wards left to decay under layers of dust and time. For decades, the building stood as a hollow reminder of its past, a relic that the town's residents avoided at all costs. It was during this period that the first stories of paranormal activity began to emerge. Passers-by reported seeing lights flicker in the upper windows, hearing faint cries carried on the wind, and spotting shadowy figures that seemed to vanish upon closer inspection. The 4th floor, in particular, became a source of fascination and fear, its sealed doors rumored to hide the remnants of its tragic past. When the Crescent was purchased by a wealthy entrepreneur in the mid-20th century, plans for its restoration sparked both excitement and controversy. The new owner envisioned a luxury hotel that would rival the grandeur of its original design, but the locals remained skeptical. Many warned that disturbing the building's slumber could awaken whatever still lingered within its walls. The renovations proceeded nonetheless, with crews working tirelessly to restore the building's former glory. Yet, even the workers reported strange occurrences: tools disappearing, footsteps echoing in empty hallways, and an inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from the fourth floor. Despite these challenges, the Crescent Hotel reopened to great fanfare, its reputation as a premier destination drawing visitors from far and wide. The management leaned into the building's haunted history, marketing it as part of the hotel's charm. Ghost tours became a nightly event, leading curious guests through the lower floors while steering clear of the fourth floor, which remained conspicuously off-limits. The official explanation was simple: the floor was undergoing continuous renovations. But for those who dared to ask, the staff's nervous glances and whispered warnings told a different story. Megan Carter's research revealed even more unsettling details about the hotel's past. During her deep dive into local archives, she unearthed an old newspaper article from the time of the hospital's operation. The headline read, "Unethical Experiments Alleged in Military Hospital." The article detailed accusations against the hospital's lead doctor, a man named Dr. Elias Thorncroft. According to former staff members, Thorncroft had been obsessed with finding a cure for the fever, resorting to experimental treatments that bordered on the grotesque. Rumors circulated of chemical injections, electroshock therapy, and other methods too horrific to imagine. Thorncroft's name disappeared from public records shortly after the hospital closed, adding an air of mystery to his ultimate fate. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that the fourth floor held the key to understanding the hospital's darkest secrets. The tales of Thorncroft's experiments, combined with the accounts of restless spirits, painted a picture of a place where the boundaries between life and death had been pushed to their breaking point. She wondered how much of the folklore was rooted in truth and how much had been embellished over time. But the more she read, the more convinced she became that something, or someone, had been left behind. As her group gathered in the hotel's cozy library on their first night, Megan shared what she had learned. Ryan listened with a journalist's skepticism, jotting down notes and occasionally interrupting with questions. Emily sat quietly, her face pale as she stared at the flickering fireplace. "It's more than just stories," she said finally. "I can feel it. The air changes when you talk about that floor." Jack, ever the pragmatist, dismissed the unease with a wave of his hand. "Ghosts or no ghosts, we've got the tools to find out what's really going on. Let's focus on gathering evidence and not get carried away." But as the night wore on, even Jack couldn't ignore the subtle signs that something was amiss. The library's lights flickered intermittently, and a cold draft seemed to sweep through the room despite the absence of open windows. When the clock struck midnight, a faint, rhythmic tapping echoed from somewhere above them. The group exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado giving way to a shared sense of foreboding. By the time they retired to their rooms, Megan's mind was awhirl with questions. What had really happened on the fourth floor? Were the stories of Thorncroft's experiments exaggerated, or was there a kernel of truth to the horror? As she lay awake in bed, the sounds of the hotel seemed to amplify: the creak of floorboards, the distant hum of the elevator, and, just beyond her hearing, the faintest hint of footsteps pacing back and forth above her. She pulled the covers tighter around her, knowing that the answers she sought might come at a cost she wasn't yet prepared to pay. The Crescent Hotel was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as the group awoke on their second day. The usual hum of morning activity, guests chatting over breakfast, or the distant rattle of housekeeping carts, was notably absent. Instead, an uneasy stillness blanketed the air, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building settling into itself. Megan was the first to notice the strange occurrences, though she chalked them up to the building's age. A door in their hallway creaked open as she passed, its hinges groaning in protest, though she swore no one had touched it. When she glanced back, the door was closed, as if it had never moved. Shrugging off the moment, she joined her friends for breakfast, where the unease deepened. The dining room was bustling with other guests, yet the staff seemed on edge. Plates clattered loudly against tables, and servers exchanged whispered conversations punctuated by furtive glances toward the elevators. Emily, ever sensitive to the emotions of others, leaned in and whispered, "They're hiding something. Look at how they avoid the fourth floor in their conversations." As the group finished their meal, Megan approached one of the housekeepers, an older woman who seemed to be avoiding the main crowd. "Excuse me," Megan began, her tone friendly. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the fourth floor." The woman's face paled, and she clutched the cleaning cloth in her hands tightly. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I don't know anything about that." "But you've worked here a long time, haven't you?" Megan pressed gently. "Surely you've heard the stories." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting around the room as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Finally, she leaned in and whispered, "Stay away from that floor. It's not safe." Before Megan could ask another question, the woman hurried away, leaving her with more questions than answers. Later that afternoon, the group decided to explore the hotel's public spaces. Jack carried his equipment bag, excited to test the EMF detector and thermal camera he had brought along. Ryan trailed behind, jotting notes in his small notebook, while Emily stayed close to Megan, her unease growing with each passing hour. The first stop was the ballroom, a cavernous space with high ceilings and ornate chandeliers. The room was beautiful but carried a faint chill that felt out of place. As the group wandered, Emily paused near a corner of the room, her brow furrowing. "Do you feel that?" she asked softly. "Feel what?" Jack replied, adjusting the settings on his EMF detector. "It's heavy," Emily said, struggling to find the right word. "Like the air is pressing down on me." Jack's EMF detector beeped suddenly, the needle spiking into the red zone. "Whoa," he muttered, holding it up. "There's definitely something here." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Megan knelt by Emily, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Let's move on," she suggested. "We don't want to stay in one spot too long." As the day progressed, the strange occurrences became harder to dismiss. In the library, a book fell from a high shelf, landing inches from Megan's feet. She picked it up, noting its title, The Unseen World, a Study of Ghostly Phenomena. A chill ran down her spine as she flipped through the pages, only to find one section heavily annotated in red ink. The handwriting was spidery and erratic, with phrases like "They watch us" and "The fourth floor is the key." Ryan, curious, snapped a photo of the book before Megan returned it to the shelf. "This place gets creepier by the second," he muttered. In the hallway leading to their rooms, Jack noticed the faint smell of antiseptic. "Do you guys smell that?" he asked. "It's like a hospital." "That doesn't make sense," Emily replied, wrinkling her nose. "This place hasn't been a hospital for decades." The smell lingered as they walked, fading only when they reached the staircase leading to the upper floors. Megan paused at the bottom of the stairs, staring at the oak door that barred access to the fourth floor. It seemed almost to pulsate with a life of its own, the brass plaque gleaming faintly in the dim light. That night, the group gathered in Megan and Emily's room to discuss their findings. Jack spread out his equipment on the bed, scrolling through the data he had collected. "There's definitely something going on here," he said. "The EMF readings are off the charts, and the thermal camera picked up some weird cold spots." "It's not just the equipment," Megan added, showing Ryan the photo of the annotated book. "There's a pattern here. Everything points back to the fourth floor." "It's not just the fourth floor," Emily interjected, her voice trembling. "It's the whole building. I keep feeling something. It's hard to describe, but it's like the walls are alive." Ryan, ever the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "Alive? Come on, Emily. That's a little dramatic." "It's not," she insisted. "I felt it in the ballroom, in the library, even in the hallways. There's something wrong with this place." The group fell silent, the weight of Emily's words settling over them. Megan broke the silence, her tone resolute. "Then we need to find out what it is. We'll start tomorrow with the staff interviews and work our way up." As they prepared for bed, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She double-checked the locks on the door and closed the curtains tightly, but the unease lingered. Lying in the dark, she listened to the sounds of the hotel, the distant hum of the elevator, the faint creak of floorboards, and, just beyond her hearing, the faintest whisper of something moving above them. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by dreams of shadowy figures and echoing footsteps. Megan awoke in the early hours of the morning to find Emily sitting by the window, staring out into the night. "Couldn't sleep?" Megan asked softly. Emily turned, her face pale and her eyes wide. "I heard something," she whispered. It was coming from the 4th floor. Megan felt a chill run down her spine. "What did you hear?" Emily hesitated, her gaze shifting to the ceiling. "A voice," she said finally. It said, "Why are you here?" The next morning dawned with a veil of dense fog blanketing the town, its grey tendrils curling against the windows of the Crescent Hotel. The group convened over breakfast in the dining room, their nerves still frayed from the strange occurrences of the previous day. Emily stirred her coffee absently, her eyes distant as though replaying the whispered words she had heard in the night. "Are we really doing this?" Ryan asked, his tone laced with skepticism but tinged with curiosity. Megan looked up from her notebook, her expression resolute. "We have to. Everything we've experienced points to the 4th floor. If we want answers, that's where we'll find them." Jack, ever pragmatic, set his camera and EMF detector on the table. "I picked up some anomalies near the stairwell yesterday. If we're going up there, we need to document everything. No one's going to believe us otherwise." Emily shivered. "It doesn't feel like we should be doing this. It feels wrong." "That's exactly why we have to," Megan countered. "If there's something up there, we need to know." Later that afternoon, the group gathered in the corridor outside the sealed oak door that led to the 4th floor. The hallway was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an almost tangible tension. Jack knelt by the door, examining the lock with a small toolkit in hand. "This shouldn't take long," he murmured, inserting a thin pick into the lock. The others stood behind him, their eyes darting nervously between the door and the empty hallway. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint click of Jack's tools. After what felt like an eternity, the lock gave a soft click, and the door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit stairwell that spiraled upward into darkness. A rush of cold air greeted them, carrying with it the faint scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic and acrid. "Well, that's inviting," Ryan muttered, his voice laced with sarcasm. Megan stepped forward, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Let's go." The ascent was slow and deliberate, each step creaking under their weight. The walls of the stairwell were lined with peeling wallpaper, the once elegant patterns now faded and marred by age. Megan's flashlight revealed faint scratches etched into the plaster, some forming jagged patterns while others appeared to spell out fragmented words: "Help, stay, why?" Emily paused, running her fingers over one of the markings. They feel recent," she whispered. Her voice trembled, and she quickly withdrew her hand. The group reached the top of the stairs, where another door awaited them. This one was heavier, reinforced with rusted iron bands. Jack pushed it open, and it groaned loudly, the sound echoing into the space beyond. The group stepped through, their flashlights illuminating a long, narrow corridor lined with doors. The 4th floor was a time capsule, frozen in the era of its hospital days. The walls were painted a sterile white, now yellowed with age and streaked with grime. Faded numbers adorned the doors, some hanging askew, others missing entirely. Wheelchairs and gurneys sat abandoned in the hallway, their metal frames rusted and wheels frozen in place. "It's like they just left," Megan murmured, her voice barely audible. Jack's EMF detector began to beep, its needle wavering erratically. "There's definitely something here," he said, his tone more serious than usual. Ryan crouched to examine a medical chart lying on the floor, its edges brittle with age. The paper detailed a patient's symptoms: high fever, tremors, hallucinations. In the margins, a note in spidery handwriting read, "Subject unresponsive. Serum failed." Emily shuddered. This place feels alive. As they moved deeper into the floor, the oppressive atmosphere intensified. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the faint light of their flashlights. One room's door was ajar, and Megan pushed it open cautiously. Inside was a small ward, its walls lined with metal beds. Most were empty, but one still held a decayed mattress with straps hanging loosely from its sides. On the far wall, faint scratches spelled out a single word: "WHY?" "What the hell happened here?" Ryan muttered, snapping a photo. Megan approached the bed, her flashlight catching something metallic glinting beneath it. She knelt and retrieved a small, tarnished locket. Opening it revealed a faded photograph of a young woman. The back was engraved with the initials LT. It must have belonged to one of the patients, Megan said, her voice tinged with sadness. The group continued their exploration, their flashlights revealing more disturbing sights. Medical charts, syringes, and rusted surgical tools littered the floor. One room contained an old wheelchair with its seat torn, dark stains marring the fabric. Another held shelves of dusty jars filled with unidentifiable substances, their labels faded beyond recognition. Then they found the wall. At the end of the hallway stood a wall covered in crude carvings, the symbols glowing faintly in the darkness. Jack ran his fingers over the surface, his expression unreadable. These aren't random. They mean something. What do you think they are? Megan asked, stepping closer. Symbols of protection, maybe, Jack replied. Or warnings. As they studied the carvings, a sudden gust of cold air rushed past them, extinguishing their flashlights. Emily screamed, clutching Megan's arm as the group was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then came the whispers. Faint and indistinct at first, they grew louder, surrounding the group in a cacophony of voices. The words were fragmented and overlapping, but one phrase repeated clearly, "Why are you here?" Jack fumbled with his flashlight, its beam flickering to life just as the whispers ceased. The group huddled together, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to go," Emily said, her voice shaking. "We shouldn't be here." Megan hesitated, torn between her curiosity and the growing sense of danger. "Just a little further," she said finally. "We're so close." They pressed on, finding a journal on a desk in what appeared to be an old nurse's station. The journal belonged to a nurse named Lillian Thatcher and detailed the horrors of the quarantine floor. One passage caught Megan's eye. "Dr. Thorncroft grows more desperate by the day. The serum isn't working, but he refuses to stop. The patients, they're suffering. And the shadows. I see them in the corners of my vision. They're always watching." The words sent a chill through Megan. She closed the journal, her hands trembling. "We need to get out of here," she said, her resolve finally breaking. As they turned to leave, the hallway behind them seemed to stretch endlessly, the door to the stairwell no longer visible. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing colder with every step. The group quickened their pace, the whispers returning, louder and more insistent. "Why are you here?" The air in the hallway grew heavier, each breath laden with an inexplicable weight. The group huddled close together, their flashlights cutting thin beams through the oppressive darkness. Emily clung to Megan's arm, her usual composure shattered. Jack held his EMF detector in one hand and a thermal camera in the other, glancing nervously at the fluctuating readings. "This place doesn't want us here," Emily murmured, her voice trembling. "We're already here," Megan replied, her tone firm but low. She tightened her grip on the nurse's journal. Its brittle pages had revealed just enough to confirm her worst fears, but not nearly enough to satisfy her need for answers. At the far end of the corridor, a door stood slightly ajar, its edges splintered and darkened as if burned. Faint wisps of something, smoke? Mist? Emily wasn't sure, curled through the gap, dissipating into the still air. "That wasn't open before," Jack said, narrowing his eyes. His voice carried a nervous edge. "I'd swear it." Ryan held up his camera, snapping a series of shots as they approached the door. "Something's drawing us in," he muttered, half to himself. "Like it's daring us." Megan pushed the door open fully, revealing a room unlike any they'd seen so far. The walls were lined with faded green tiles, cracked and stained with time. A long metal table dominated the center of the space, its surface corroded and pitted. Surgical tools lay scattered across it, their once gleaming steel dulled to a sinister gray. A single overhead lamp hung crookedly, its light flickering faintly. Jack's thermal camera beeped, drawing everyone's attention. "There's a cold spot," he said, pointing toward the far corner of the room. The group turned their flashlights in unison, illuminating what appeared to be an old hospital bed. The mattress was bare, its fabric torn to reveal rusted springs beneath. On the floor beside it lay a pair of restraints, their leather straps brittle and cracked. Emily froze. "I've seen this place before," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What do you mean?" Megan asked, stepping closer to her friend. Emily's gaze remained fixed on the bed. "In my dreams. It's always this room. And there's always someone lying there." As if in response, the faintest sound echoed through the room, a low, guttural moan. The group spun toward the source, their flashlights dancing across the tiled walls. The sound grew louder, taking on a rhythmic cadence that set their nerves on edge. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, backing toward the door. "Not yet," Megan replied. She pointed her flashlight toward a cabinet in the corner. Its doors were ajar, revealing rows of glass jars filled with murky, viscous liquids. Floating within them were indistinct shapes, some resembling organs, others, something else entirely. Megan moved closer, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Among the jars was a stack of faded photographs bound with a leather strap. She picked them up carefully, her hands trembling as she flipped through the images. Each photo depicted scenes from the hospital's operation, doctors and nurses standing beside patients, surgical procedures in progress, and one image of the very room they stood in now. But one photo made her pause. It showed a man in a white coat standing in front of a group of restrained patients. His face was obscured by shadows, but his posture exuded authority. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note, "Dr. Thorncroft, Final Trials, 1918. "This is him," Megan said, holding up the photo. "Dr. Thorncroft. He's the one responsible for all of this." The room seemed to respond to her words. The faint moan escalated into a wailing sound, the walls vibrating as if the building itself were alive. Jack's EMF detector let out a sharp, piercing whine, its needle spiking uncontrollably. "We're not alone," Jack muttered, backing away from the table. Emily suddenly gasped and grabbed her head, her knees buckling. "They're here," she choked out, her voice distorted. "They don't want us here." Ryan and Jack rushed to her side, helping her to sit on the floor. Her body trembled, her eyes glassy and unfocused. "Emily, what's happening?" Megan asked, kneeling in front of her friend. Emily's voice was a mix of her own and something deeper, something otherworldly. "He's coming," she said. "The doctor. You woke him up." The group didn't have time to process her words. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, heavy and deliberate. Megan's heart raced as she turned toward the door, her flashlight trembling in her hand. A shadow appeared in the doorway, its outline vaguely humanoid but unnervingly distorted. It lingered for a moment before stepping into the room. The figure was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a featureless mask. Its movements were jerky, as though it were a puppet controlled by invisible strings. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the light and warping the space. The group froze, their terror rendering them silent. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at Megan. Its voice was a hollow, echoing rasp. "Why did you come here?" Megan struggled to find her voice. We wanted to know the truth," she stammered. The figure tilted its head, the gesture almost curious. "The truth is pain," it said. "The truth is death." Suddenly, the overhead lamp burst, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted as the group scrambled to find their flashlights. The wailing sound reached an unbearable pitch, filling their ears with a cacophony of screams and whispers. Megan felt a hand grab her arm, but when she turned, no one was there. "We need to leave. Now," Ryan shouted over the noise. Jack grabbed Emily, who was still trembling and unresponsive, and hauled her to her feet. Megan stuffed the photos and journal into her bag, her instincts screaming at her to run. The group stumbled out of the room, the oppressive atmosphere following them into the hallway. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls narrowing and warping as they ran. Doors slammed shut behind them, and the whispers grew louder, forming words they couldn't understand. At the far end of the hallway, the stairwell door loomed like a beacon. But just as they reached it, the door vanished, replaced by a solid wall. The group skidded to a halt, their breathing ragged as they turned back. The shadowy figure stood at the other end of the hallway, its form growing larger and more distorted. Megan clutched the journal tightly. There has to be another way, she said, scanning the walls for any sign of an exit. Jack pointed to a nearby room, its door slightly ajar. In there. The group rushed inside, slamming the door behind them. The room was empty except for a single window that overlooked the town below. Megan approached it, her breath fogging the glass. "We're trapped," she whispered. From behind them, the whispers coalesced into a single, deafening word. "Why?" The room was cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into the bones. Megan shivered as she clutched the nurse's journal to her chest, her breath visible in the dim light. The group huddled together, their flashlights creating sharp beams that barely pierced the oppressive darkness. The shadowy figure from the hallway was gone, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed down on them. "We need to figure this out," Megan said, her voice trembling but resolute. "This journal has answers, it has to." She flipped through the brittle pages, scanning the spidery handwriting for anything that might explain what they were facing. The entries detailed the hospital's grim operations during its wartime years, from desperate attempts to treat the fever to the unspeakable experiments conducted by Dr. Thorncroft. But one entry stood out, its words underlined multiple times. "The serum has failed. The patients, they are no longer themselves. They linger in the shadows, their forms twisted by pain and despair. Dr. Thorncroft insists we must continue, but I fear we have gone too far. The fourth floor is cursed, a prison for the souls we could not save." Megan read the passage aloud, her voice echoing in the empty room. Emily clutched her head, shaking as if trying to block out the words. "They're still here," she whispered. "They're trapped, and they blame us." Jack paced the room, his flashlight flickering. "So what do we do? Apologize to a bunch of ghosts and hope they let us go?" "It's not that simple," Megan replied. She turned to Emily, who seemed to be teetering on the edge of some unseen abyss. "Emily, you said earlier that you felt something, a connection. Can you communicate with them?" Emily looked up, her eyes wide and unfocused. "They're in pain," she murmured. "They want to be heard." Ryan, ever the skeptic, crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" "Hold a séance." His sarcasm faltered under the weight of the room's oppressive energy. "Okay, fine. Let's assume this is real. What are we supposed to say?" Megan scanned the journal again, her fingers tracing the lines of text. "It says here that Thorncroft used the serum to try to cure them, but it only made things worse. Maybe they need closure, an acknowledgement of what happened to them." The group decided to return to the hallway, where the carvings on the walls seemed to hold a strange power. Jack used his thermal camera to scan the area, noting how the symbols emitted faint, almost imperceptible heat signatures. "These markings, they're like a boundary," he said. "Maybe they were meant to contain whatever's here." Megan knelt beside one of the symbols, running her fingers over its rough edges. "Or maybe they're a way to communicate," she mused. She retrieved a piece of chalk from her bag, a leftover item from her research kit, and began tracing one of the symbols on the floor. As she completed the shape, the air around them grew colder, and the faint whispers returned, louder this time. "What are you doing?" Ryan demanded, his voice rising in panic. "Trying to reach them," Megan replied. She pressed the chalk to the floor again, drawing another symbol from the journal. The whispers grew clearer, forming fragmented words. "Why, here, pain." Emily gasped, her body trembling. "They're asking why we're here," she said. "And they're in pain." The group's flashlights flickered simultaneously, plunging them into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the shadowy figure stood at the far end of the hallway, its form more distinct now. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and twisted. Its face was a void, an absence of features that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. "What do you want?" Megan called out, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural motion that sent a shiver down her spine. "Why did you come?" it rasped, its voice a guttural echo that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Megan stepped forward, holding up the journal. "We came to understand," she said. "To learn the truth about what happened here." The figure's form flickered, as if struggling to maintain its shape. The whispers swelled, filling the hallway with a cacophony of voices. Among them, one phrase emerged clearly: he must answer. Emily collapsed to her knees, clutching her head. "It's too much," she cried. "There's so much pain, so much anger." Jack knelt beside her, his face pale. "We need to get her out of here." "No," Emily said, her voice suddenly firm. She looked up, her eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "They won't let us leave until we face him." "Face who?" Ryan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Emily pointed toward the figure. "Dr. Thorncroft." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of Emily's words sinking in. Megan flipped through the journal, searching for any mention of how to confront the doctor. One entry caught her eye. "The spirits linger because of him. They cannot move on until he is held accountable. The serum bound them here, their agony a tether they cannot break. To free them, the truth must be revealed, and he must answer for his sins." Megan read the passage aloud, her voice steady despite the growing sense of dread. "We have to make him answer," she said. "But how do we do that?" The figure began to move, its jerky motions drawing it closer. The group backed away, their flashlights trained on its approaching form. Megan gripped the journal tightly, her mind racing. "The symbols," she said suddenly. "We need to complete the symbols. They're part of the ritual." Jack nodded, pulling chalk from his bag. "Tell me what to draw," he said. Megan flipped to a page in the journal depicting a series of interconnected symbols. She described them to Jack, who worked quickly, his hands trembling as he sketched the intricate designs on the floor. The figure paused, its form flickering as the first symbol was completed. "It's working," Emily said, her voice laced with awe and fear. As Jack completed the final symbol, the air around them grew still. The figure stopped its advance, standing motionless in the center of the hallway. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through their very bones. "Now what?" Ryan asked, his voice barely audible. The journal slipped from Megan's hands, landing open on the floor. Its pages flipped rapidly, as if guided by an unseen force, before settling on a blank page. Slowly, words began to appear, written in the same spidery handwriting. "Speak the truth. Acknowledge the pain. Release the bound." Megan swallowed hard, her throat dry. "We have to address them," she said. "All of them." The group formed a circle around the symbols, their flashlights casting long, wavering shadows. Megan took a deep breath and began to speak, her words carrying the weight of the truth she had uncovered. "You were wronged," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "Dr. Thorncroft's experiments brought you pain and suffering. He didn't listen, didn't see you as human. But we see you. We acknowledge your pain, and we're here to set you free." The figure tilted its head again, the void where its face should have been seeming to focus on Megan. The hum grew louder, resonating through the hallway as the symbols on the floor began to glow faintly. "We're sorry," Megan continued, "for everything that was done to you. For the pain that keeps you here." The figure took a step back, its form flickering violently. The whispers returned, softer now, blending into a single voice that said, "Truth." The glowing symbols flared brightly, filling the hallway with an intense light. The figure dissolved into the brightness, its form unraveling like smoke in the wind. The group shielded their eyes, the light growing so intense it was almost blinding. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded, leaving the hallway silent and still. The oppressive weight in the air was gone, replaced by a strange sense of peace. Megan lowered her hands, her heart pounding. "It's over," she whispered. The air on the fourth floor shifted, growing colder and thicker with an unnatural density. The silence was deafening, as if the entire world had been muted, leaving only the sound of the group's breathing and the faint creak of the old floorboards beneath their feet. Megan clutched the nurse's journal tightly, the spidery handwriting within now etched into her memory. The glowing symbols on the floor still pulsed faintly, their light casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. "It's not over," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were wide and glassy, locked on the far end of the hallway where the shadowy figure had vanished moments before. "It's just beginning." Jack adjusted his grip on the thermal camera, which had begun emitting a series of sharp beeps. The screen showed a growing hotspot at the end of the corridor, the temperature spiking to unnatural levels. "We've got movement," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's coming." Ryan's flashlight flickered, the beam stuttering as if the light itself was afraid. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice strained. "Now." "We can't leave," Megan said firmly, though her own fear was evident in the way her hands shook. "Not yet." The journal said we have to confront it to make it answer. The hallway seemed to stretch and twist, the walls warping as though the building itself were alive. Shadows pooled in the corners, dark and impenetrable, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. Megan's heart raced as she flipped through the journal, searching for anything that could guide them. "There's a passage here," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "It talks about the final stage, when the presence fully manifests. It says the spirits will show their true form, and we have to hold our ground." "Hold our ground?" Ryan repeated, his voice rising. "Against what?" As if in answer, the shadows at the end of the hallway coalesced into a towering form. It was no longer the vaguely humanoid figure they had seen before. This was something far more grotesque. Its body was elongated and distorted, its limbs too long and its movements unnaturally jerky. Its face was a void, a black abyss that seemed to pull at the edges of reality. Around it, the air shimmered with an oppressive heat, distorting their vision like a mirage. "It's him," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dr. Thorncroft." The figure took a step forward, its movements accompanied by a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the hallway. The glowing symbols on the floor flickered violently, their light dimming as if the entity's presence was draining their power. Jack's EMF detector went wild, the needle spiking into the red zone and emitting a piercing wail. "What do we do?" Jack shouted over the noise, his voice tinged with panic. Megan took a step forward, her hands trembling but her resolve firm. "We make him answer," she said, holding up the journal. "Dr. Thorncroft, we know what you did. We know about the experiments, the pain you caused. You have to face the truth." The entity paused, its head tilting as if considering her words. The shadows around it writhed and twisted, forming faint, humanoid shapes that seemed to echo the suffering of the patients who had been trapped here. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct now, overlapping voices that cried out in anguish and anger. "Why did you let this happen? We trusted you. You took everything from us." The figure let out an inhuman screech, the sound piercing and guttural. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and frost began to form on the walls and floor. Megan's breath fogged in the frigid air as she took another step forward. "You can't hide from what you did," she said, her voice shaking but steady. "These people deserved better. They deserved peace." Emily suddenly gasped, her body trembling violently. She clutched her head, her eyes rolling back as she began to speak in a voice that was not her own. "You don't understand," she said, the words guttural and distorted. "He thought he was saving us. He thought he could fix it. But he only made it worse." The group stared at her in stunned silence. Megan reached out, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Who are you?" she asked gently. "One of them," Emily replied, her voice still alien. "We're trapped because of him. Because of his pride." The entity let out another screech, its form flickering violently. The humanoid shapes around it began to coalesce, their faces twisted in agony. Megan realized with a sinking feeling that these were the patients, the souls Thorncroft had condemned to this endless torment. Jack fumbled with his equipment, pulling out a small speaker connected to an EVP recorder. "If they want to be heard, maybe this will help," he said, setting the device on the floor. He activated the recorder, and the air was immediately filled with distorted voices. "Why won't you let us go? He has to pay." The serum was poison. Megan's mind raced as she pieced together the fragments of their story. "They're not just angry at Thorncroft," she said. "They're angry at themselves, at each other. They're stuck in a cycle of blame and pain." The entity took another step forward, its presence overwhelming. Megan flipped to the final page of the journal, her eyes scanning the spidery text. "It says we have to make them see," she said. "We have to break the cycle." "How?" Ryan asked, his voice rising in panic. "How do we do that?" Megan looked at Emily, who had collapsed to her knees, her body trembling as the voices continued to pour out of her. "Emily," Megan said softly, "you can hear them. You can feel what they're feeling. Help me talk to them." Emily looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "They're so angry," she whispered. "So lost." "Then let's help them find their way," Megan said, her voice firm. Together, Megan and Emily began to speak, their voices rising above the cacophony of whispers. They spoke of forgiveness, of letting go of the pain that bound them to this place. They acknowledged the suffering, the betrayal, and the loss, but also the hope that the cycle could end. The entity paused, its form flickering as if struggling to maintain its shape. The humanoid figures around it began to waver, their anguished expressions softening. The whispers grew quieter, the voices blending into a single, harmonious hum. The glowing symbols on the floor flared brightly, their light filling the hallway with a warm, golden glow. The frost on the walls melted, and the oppressive cold began to lift. The entity let out one final, deafening screech before its form dissolved into the light, leaving the hallway silent and still. Megan lowered the journal, her hands trembling. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They're free," she said. "They're finally free." The group stood in silence, the weight of what they had just experienced settling over them. The hallway, once filled with shadows and despair, now felt lighter, as if the building itself had taken a deep breath and exhaled. "Let's get out of here," Jack said, his voice breaking the silence. "Before anything else happens." Megan nodded, tucking the journal into her bag. As they made their way back to the stairwell, she couldn't help but glance back at the empty hallway, a sense of peace mingling with the lingering unease. They had uncovered the truth, but the cost of that truth would stay with them forever. The hallway fell eerily silent, the air heavy with the tension of something unresolved. Megan clutched the nurse's journal tightly against her chest, its edges digging into her palms as if grounding her against the growing tide of fear. The glowing symbols on the floor pulsed faintly, casting an otherworldly light that did little to dispel the encroaching darkness. "This is it," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their labored breathing. "The moment we make our stand." Jack adjusted the strap of his thermal camera, glancing nervously at Emily, who was still trembling but seemed more composed than before. Ryan stood nearby, his knuckles white as he gripped a flashlight that barely pierced the gloom. "What if we're wrong?" Ryan asked, his voice edged with desperation. "What if this thing can't be stopped?" Emily shook her head, her voice steady despite the quiver in her hands. "It has to be stopped," she said. "Not just for us, but for them." Megan nodded, flipping to the final page of the journal. The spidery handwriting detailed the conclusion of the ritual, a confrontation, an acknowledgement, and a final act of defiance. "We have to stand together," Megan said, looking each of them in the eye. "This isn't just about survival. It's about giving them peace." The oppressive darkness at the end of the hallway began to shift, the shadows pooling and writhing as if alive. The figure of Dr. Thorncroft emerged, its form more grotesque than before. His elongated limbs stretched unnaturally, and his void-like face seemed to devour the faint light. Around him, spectral shapes of the patients he had wronged materialized, their anguished faces flickering in and out of focus. "You shouldn't be here," Thorncroft rasped, his voice a guttural echo that reverberated through the walls. "You don't understand what you've awakened." Megan stepped forward, holding the journal like a shield. "We understand enough," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "We know what you did. The experiments, the pain, the suffering, it all ends here." The spectral patients wailed, their cries blending into a haunting chorus that made the walls tremble. Thorncroft's form flickered violently, as if struggling to maintain its shape. "They were sacrifices," he said, his tone defensive yet hollow. "Necessary for progress." "They were people," Emily interjected, her voice breaking. She stepped forward, her trembling hand reaching out as if to touch the apparitions. "You took everything from them. You took their lives, their humanity, and now they're trapped here because of you." Thorncroft let out a guttural roar, the sound filled with rage and denial. The spectral patients surged forward, their forms twisting and elongating as they surrounded him. The air grew frigid, frost creeping along the walls and floor. Jack's thermal camera beeped frantically, its screen filled with an overload of red and blue. "What do we do?" Ryan shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of wails and roars. "We finish the ritual," Megan said, flipping to the marked page in the journal. "We have to break the cycle. Acknowledge their pain and demand justice." Megan began to recite the incantation from the journal, her voice strong and clear. The symbols on the floor flared to life, their golden glow intensifying. Thorncroft recoiled, his form becoming more unstable, while the spectral patients hesitated, their anguished faces softening as they turned toward Megan. "We see you," Megan said, her voice filled with empathy. "We acknowledge your pain, your loss, your suffering. You deserved better. You deserved peace." The wails of the patients quieted, their forms becoming more defined and human-like. Thorncroft let out another roar, his voice filled with desperation. "You can't do this," he snarled. "They belong to me." Emily stepped forward, her voice steady and resolute. "They belong to themselves," she said. "And it's time they were free." The hallway began to shake, the walls cracking as the oppressive energy reached a fever pitch. Megan continued the incantation, the words flowing from her lips as if she had always known them. The symbols on the floor pulsed in time with her words, their light forming a protective barrier around the group. Thorncroft lunged forward, his grotesque form stretching unnaturally as he reached for Megan. Jack reacted quickly, using the flash of his thermal camera to momentarily blind the entity. Thorncroft recoiled, his form flickering violently. "Keep going," Jack shouted, resetting the camera for another burst. Megan finished the incantation, the final words ringing out like a bell. The spectral patients turned toward Thorncroft, their expressions filled with anger and resolve. They surged forward, their forms merging into a single, radiant light that engulfed him. Thorncroft let out a final, deafening scream as the light consumed him, his form disintegrating into nothingness. The hallway grew still, the oppressive darkness lifting as the golden light faded. The spectral patients lingered for a moment, their forms serene and at peace, before dissolving into the air. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of what had just occurred settling over them. The hallway, once a place of fear and despair, now felt light and empty, as if the building itself had been cleansed. "It's over," Megan said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "They're free," she said. "Finally free." Jack lowered his camera, his hands trembling. "Let's get out of here," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Before anything else happens." Megan tucked the journal into her bag, her fingers lingering on its worn cover. As they made their way back to the stairwell, she couldn't help but glance back at the now empty hallway. A sense of peace mingled with the lingering unease, a reminder of the cost of uncovering the truth. The stairwell door slammed shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the quiet building. For the first time since stepping onto the fourth floor, the oppressive atmosphere had lifted. The air felt lighter, breathable. Yet the silence that followed was not one of peace, but of reverent finality, as though the building itself were acknowledging the closure of a century-old wound. Megan leaned heavily against the railing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her hands were still clutching the nurse's journal, its spine cracked and its pages smudged with the fingerprints of their ordeal. She glanced back at the hallway they had left behind, its once twisting shadows now banished, replaced by nothing but an empty corridor fading into the distance. "We did it," she whispered, though the words felt hollow. Her voice trembled, and she wasn't sure if it was from exhaustion, relief, or something else she couldn't yet name. Jack slumped to the floor beside her, his camera still strapped to his chest. "What the hell just happened?" he muttered, his voice shaky but alive with the adrenaline still coursing through him. Was that real? Ryan, who had been uncharacteristically silent throughout their escape, let out a hollow laugh. "Real enough to almost get us killed," he said, running a hand through his damp hair. His flashlight flickered weakly in his other hand before finally giving out, plunging them into the dim glow of the emergency lights. Emily sat down heavily on the step below them, her face pale and streaked with tears. "They're gone," she said softly, almost to herself. "I can't feel them anymore." Megan turned to her, her expression softening. What do you mean? The patients, Emily said, her gaze fixed on the floor. Their pain, their anger, it was like a constant pressure, pushing against me the whole time we were up there. But now, it's gone. They are free. The group lingered in the stairwell, their exhaustion mingling with the weight of what they had just experienced. Megan finally broke the silence, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath it. We need to tell someone about this, she said, holding up the journal. This proves everything. And who exactly is going to believe us? Ryan shot back, his tone edged with frustration. We just faced off with a ghost doctor and his legion of spectral patients. That's not exactly something you can put in a police report. He's right, Jack said, though reluctantly. Even with the journal and the footage, people are going to think we faked it. Megan's grip on the journal tightened. Maybe, she admitted. But we owe it to them, the patients, the people who suffered here, to make sure their story is told. As they descended the stairs, the hotel around them seemed unnaturally still, as though holding its breath. The lobby was empty, the usual hum of activity conspicuously absent. The concierge desk was vacant, and the soft strains of classical music that had greeted them upon their arrival were nowhere to be heard. Emily paused near the front doors, her hand hovering over the handle. Do you think it's really over? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Megan hesitated before answering. For now, she said. But places like this, they never really let go. Back at the university, the group reconvened in Megan's small apartment, their makeshift headquarters for processing what had happened. The journal lay open on the coffee table, its pages illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp. Jack's laptop was hooked up to the camera, the screen displaying distorted images of the hallway, the glowing symbols, and fleeting glimpses of the spectral patients. Most of the footage is corrupted, Jack said, scrolling through the files. But there are some frames that, well, they're impossible to explain. He paused on an image of Thorncroft's shadowy form, his void-like face staring directly into the lens. The group shuddered collectively, the memory of his presence still fresh in their minds. What about the symbols? Emily asked, her gaze fixed on the glowing markings visible in the footage. I've been trying to cross-reference them, Megan said, pulling up a browser on her laptop. Some of them match old alchemical symbols, but others are completely unique. It's like a mix of science and ritual. Over the next few days, Megan dove deeper into her research, piecing together the story of the hospital and its dark past. She discovered more about Dr. Thorncroft, a once celebrated physician whose obsession with curing the fever led him down a path of unethical experiments and eventual disgrace. His disappearance after the hospital's closure had been shrouded in mystery, and his name had all but vanished from historical records. But Megan's discovery didn't end there. The journal contained entries that hinted at something even darker, an experimental serum designed not just to cure, but to transform. The final pages detailed Thorncroft's belief that he could transcend human limitations, using his patients as unwilling test subjects. He wasn't just trying to cure them, Megan said during one of their late-night meetings. He was trying to turn them into something else. Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Something they never asked to be, he said. No wonder they were so angry. One evening, as Megan reviewed the journal for what felt like the 100th time, a knock at her door startled her. She opened it to find a small package on the floor, with no return address. Inside was a single object, the key to the 4th floor, its brass surface tarnished and cold to the touch. Alongside it was a note, written in the same spidery handwriting as the journal. You're not done yet. Megan's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the key. The weight of its implications settled over her, a mix of dread and determination. She knew the story of the 4th floor wasn't over. There were still questions to answer, truths to uncover, and perhaps, more souls to set free. Weeks later, Megan stood at the edge of the university campus, watching as the autumn leaves fell in a cascade of red and gold. The journal sat in her bag, a constant reminder of what she had faced and what she had yet to confront. Emily, Jack, and Ryan had agreed to take a break from their investigations, but Megan knew she couldn't let it go. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance, a figure standing beneath a tree, its face obscured by shadows. For a moment, she thought it was Thorncroft, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. Megan tightened her grip on the bag and walked away, her heart heavy but her resolve unshaken. The fourth floor had given her a purpose she hadn't known she needed. And as much as it terrified her, she knew she would return. Because some stories refuse to stay buried. And some truths demand to be uncovered.